thank you again for having me. I really, really do appreciate it. And for that brilliant presentation, Ava, which does have so many themes that I think hopefully I'll be able to pick up a little bit of, and indeed we pick up in our work. I just thought very, very briefly before I start, I'd say who we are at Compassion in Politics and the sort of rationale for our existence. We set up we launched in 2018. And really the purpose was, I co-founded this organization with a colleague who I'd worked with for many, many years, Jennifer Nadel. We had both worked in single issue campaigns and for a political party. Through that had both come to this sort of similar realization that all the problems that exist with political parties that I think we're probably all aware of, added to which we felt like at times the single issue campaigns and indeed charities themselves contribute to that by creating these borders over which they won't tread, or that, setting up conflict with one another, and that there wasn't an organization really in the UK that was looking at those fundamental questions, the types of questions we're trying to address today, about why do we have government? Why do we have political systems? What values do we want to be at the heart of it? Can we create a more common narrative about what we expect from politicians if we are to have politicians as leaders? So that was the purpose of setting up. We're sort of both a think tank and a campaign. It's sometimes not always easy to put us in a box, or we struggle, but we try and do original research, work with academics who are already working in this field, and then we work through an all-party group in Westminster with other campaign groups and with activists and individual politicians. So we're sort of trying to bridge those two divides. And lastly, the reason we struck on compassion as being the principle that we really wanted to put at the heart of what we were doing was both because there's a lot of psychological research that's gone into the value of compassion, how you can apply it to societies, to individuals as a form of training, coaching, therapy. But also picking up on some of those things that Ava was mentioning. It's that ability to be honest, to realize that you're going to make mistakes, that you're a human being with flaws, that you're going to need support from others. And if we could just bring a small amount of that into politics, we think we might make a bit of a difference. So let's see if I can get this to work. Come on. We might just be stuck with my introduction slide. Here's a preview, which I didn't intend to give you. Oh, sorry. Right. So very, very briefly then, what do we mean by relational governance, or how do we approach this at Compassion in Politics? And these are really, really very basic points, which all of you will know, but I just felt like it was worth reinforcing because this is where we come from. So the basic fact that political decisions are made by humans for humans, whether they are deliberately through a representative democracy, or whether it is a fact of just the political structure that you exist in, that you have, whichever style of government it is, you're going to have humans making decisions on behalf of other humans. But they do so in a way in which they interact with other humans. And a lot of the time, in our estimation, that is done in a way in which they have no real control or concept over how that is done. So they will do so, as I will come on to explain, in very fraught, conflictual circumstances, without the benefit of any kind of mindful approach or compassionate approach. They also don't necessarily do so in a deliberative way with the types of people that they are seeking to represent. Ava mentioned towards the end some really brilliant examples where that does happen, but it is not happening enough as far as we're concerned. And then lastly, in doing that, they're also influenced by what humans think other humans think about them. So they're influenced by what they think their leaders think, what they think the media think, the public think. And all of that will filter through into their decision-making processes. Again, in a way in which we feel there's just simply not enough awareness or education about. So that's kind of how we approach relational governance, is also to an extent why we exist, because we think these are big problems, or at least issues that need to be looked at. And so here I just go on to describe a little bit more about what I mean. We need to vastly improve the psychological literacy in politics, particularly amongst senior decision makers, but amongst the population at large would also be a very welcome thing. Politicians need to know much more about their own personal triggers, the issues that they bring to the game, how these arise in the political environment, how the political environment encourages compassion or encourages conflict, competition, animosity, how they are contributing to that themselves as well in the way that they interact with others. There, in particular, I think as well is the culture that they set and the stories and the narratives that they tell about politics. And just taking a step back, certainly in Britain, the political culture and the way that people talk about other political parties through their campaigning literature, the kind of stories they'll tell in the press, it is all about conflict. It's all about winning. It's all about competition. That in itself creates a climate of fear and animosity. It divides the population into different tribes. Ken was saying at the beginning how political parties already established that process, and it's essentially a fallout from there. Added to which is not, I mean, there is a lot of research in the general area, but in the UK, there's not a lot of research into the very specific effects that has in politics and how it plays out in our system of democracy. There are people doing some work. The British Psychological Society have done some, the Mindfulness Institute, and we are following in their footsteps to a degree. But in terms of then taking some of that work, applying it specifically to Westminster and looking and working with politicians to educate them and help them, very little done. So this is why we've sort of tried to step into the field. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about then how we sort of can use the relational approach to try and change governance using some of the research that we've done and the thoughts that we've had, both, across three areas: politician to politician, politician to public, and public to politician. Right, politician to politicians. So, as I say, incredibly competitive political system in the UK, and one that we have unfortunately given to a number of other countries in the world. That's our contribution. We have an electoral system which largely pushes voters' choice down to two parties. That in itself is creating competition. Everything is always about the two-horse race, which of the two parties is going to win. That obviously limits plurality. It means that people feel like they're not properly represented. And it means that Conservatives and Labour see one another as enemies. The Commons itself is designed to maximise conflict. We have the benches are set deliberately opposing one another, which is very unusual now in the modern day. The two-party leaders are separated to be deliberately two sword lengths apart so that they don't draw their swords and stab one another. We have the number of seats in Westminster is also deliberately limited. There are roughly 430, 440 seats in the Commons, but there's 650 MPs, and they do that deliberately to create a sense of hostility, temperature rising. It's really playing to the gallery. We have the whips here in the UK. It's not a system that we've given everyone, but this is basically a system of formalized bullying in which parties are allowed to keep notes on their members and tell them that they're going to release something to the public if they don't toe the line, or that they won't get a career advancement that they're searching for. And MPs vote in public. They're not able to do so in private or via an electronic means. They have to go through doors to actually to vote, and so they can be cajoled into voting a particular way. They can also be seen by their leaders to have voted in a particular way. And our research, this is some of the original research we have done, shows that parties are actually, well, Conservatives and Labour, we have to admit we've fallen into the trap ourselves, but we focused on them. But the Conservative and Labour Party are now more divided than at any other point in the 21st century. They are least likely it's in 2020 we did the research, to agree, and by agree we meant vote with one another, than any other point, and it's just got progressively worse and worse. So here's some of the old proposals that we've put forward, and we're working on some. Others we've sort of said this is what needs to happen, but resources, we can't push this forward. Complete redesign at the Commons. We can't continue to have two groups opposing one another. We need a horseshoe or semicircular shape. We would completely remove the whips. It's such an anachronism that is still continues. We would like to see MPs scattered across the Commons, so they no longer sit in those tribes that they currently do, baying at one another. Indeed, we also want to end booing and jeering in the Commons, because that completely is designed to raise the temperature again. And we would introduce electronic voting so that MPs are able to at least vote in private when they are in the act of voting, although we accept, of course, it needs to be public knowledge how they have then voted. On to the next bit, politician to public. So largely in the UK, as I'm sure is the case elsewhere, politicians are quite out of touch, as people like to say. And we see this in a huge lack of diversity. The number of MPs from private schools, the number that are white, male, middle-aged, compared to the rest of the population. But while there's obviously important work to be done to increase diversity, we believe every politician can learn an awful lot more about those that they govern. So the things that we are looking to do, and this draws back on relational theory, contact theory. Basic idea, as everyone will know, that if you can understand a little bit more about the people that you are interacting with, you are more likely to show empathy and compassion than if they are just simply seen as an other that you believe is hostile towards you. So we want it to be compulsory that experts by experience should be involved in all major policy decisions. We'd like to see that example that Ava gave spread out across policymaking in general. We have proposed constituency boards. These are largely, I have to say, just a copy of what Ireland has done and many other countries with citizens' assemblies. But rather than having them focused purely on single issues, we would recommend that every constituency has a board of around 12 people selected by sortition, who would represent different backgrounds, different political party views and none, and meet with their MP at least 4 times a year for a moderated discussion about the kind of issues that they are facing. So something similar to Ava's example of the Bristol mayor, who brought people in right at the beginning of his administration. And then we also want to bring compassion training into Parliament. And this is something we are really working quite hard on, and hopeful that we will be able to do soon, or at least a trial of compassion training. On to the next slide. So public to politician. As we know, public trust in politicians is an all-time low. I'm not quite sure how this maps out across the countries that are represented today, but in the UK, politicians always come last in any polling of trust in particular institutions. They fall even below our journalists, lawyers, the lot. Obviously, it's our belief, coming from a compassionate perspective, that there are good politicians who do want to do the very best. And we've talked to politicians daily who, say they came in to make a difference, but the system has crushed them. They have really had their souls sapped. And so there's now this, and to an extent, when you see the abuse that they receive from members of the public, from the press, you can understand. So we now have, this complete divide. There's 2 populations existing. There's the politicians and there's the public, and then within them, there's divisions within both. This is an area of work that we're only really just starting. But what we want to do is look at the main conduit between politicians and the public, and that's the media. And Ken mentioned that in his introduction. So we're looking to address this both through how traditional media talks about politics, how interviews are conducted, how they're always designed to try and catch the politician out, to try and have a Yahoo moment where they can get shared on social media, rather than having a genuine deliberative conversation about what's in the interests of the country. And also social media, so trying to reduce the abuse on social media. We have an online safety bill coming forwards very soon in the UK, which we're quite hopeful that we'll get some amendments to, that will introduce a duty of care on social media companies, require them to significantly reduce the use of anonymous accounts where possible and where they are continually abusing or being used to abuse elements like that, which will hopefully make some contribution to the discourse, the type of discourse that we have. I'm wary of time. I'll just wrap up with a couple more slides. So the barriers to action, this was one of the things that Shato asked us to address. I mean, this is speaking largely from the UK perspective, but of course, these are issues that carry across the globe. Tradition, I mean, especially in the UK, though, that one, the Palace of Westminster, whatever it is, politicians, when they go there, I think they really love to feel that they're part of this illustrious elite, and Westminster really does enforce that. You go from Eton to an illustrious university and on to Parliament. The size of the political bureaucracy in the UK is enormous. Although power is heavily concentrated in Westminster, you only have to think about, at Westminster, you have 2 houses of Parliament, you have 650 MPs, roughly 800 lords. You have the political party machinery, you have lobbyist think tanks, of which, fair play, we're one of them, campaigning organisations. And working out where you address these issues is very, very difficult, and there's a lot of intransigence. You have a limited HR procedure in Parliament as well, so all of that has to be thought about. And then the wider culture of society, which kind of refers back to some of the issues I've been talking about, which is, what narratives do we tell about politics? What are the relationships like between public and the politicians? And they are obviously extremely soured at the moment. Lastly, some thoughts on how we overcome this, or how we're trying to overcome this. First of all, we work primarily with open-minded and like-minded, not like-minded, actually, I think that would be a mistake to leave that with you, open-minded politicians who want to change things. And obviously they're the low-hanging fruit in a way, but if we can support them, provide them with training, provide them with resources, reinforce what they're doing, we feel we can make a difference. We do a lot of work proving the public case for reform. We do a lot of research showing, using polling to try and show that actually, despite what you may think, there's a really reasonable, good majority out there who don't want lying and misrepresentation and bullying in politics, and they want things to be better. They just currently don't believe it can be. We're trying to bring in experimentation, so things like compassion training or having committees try different ways of working, rather than this sort of, as I say, this kind of gotcha moment where they have a representative from the government there and they try and pin them down and show how stupid they are. That actually maybe we'll go for some deliberative processes where we tackle issues collectively. And lastly, we want to maximize the message across charities and campaigns. And this goes back to what I said at the beginning about our purpose, that we felt there was this missing narrative about what politics is for. So we try and work collaboratively as much as possible to share the research we're doing, share the kind of narrative of compassion that we're trying to push out. And sorry, that was a rush through at the end, but that is me.